Dear listeners, we would love to get to know you better. Please write in the comments which country and city you are watching us from. Thank you. I grew up in a small Midwest town surrounded by endless fields and a close-knit community. My childhood was a mix of ordinary days and extraordinary dreams. My parents, though not wealthy, instilled in me a sense of ambition and discipline. My dad was a veteran who shared stories of resilience, and my mom was a nurturing force who held our family together. High school was where I began shaping my identity. I excelled in math and science, dreaming of becoming an engineer. My best friend Jace and I spent countless hours sketching out imaginary machines and planning our futures. It was the bold one, always pushing boundaries, while I preferred the safety of clear rules and steady goals. After graduation, life took us in unexpected directions. Jace joined the military while I pursued engineering in college, but financial challenges and youthful mistakes led me to a crossroads, and I found myself enlisting as well. The Army became a crucible, forging me into someone stronger but also more guarded. By the time I returned home, I was a changed man. The innocence of my youth had been replaced by the weight of experience. I channeled my energy into education, eventually securing a job at GM where I met Sally. She was a light in my life, someone who brought color to the grayness that had settled over me. Together we built a life, a family, and a home, something I thought was unshakable. Jace seeped back into me gradually, as though I were emerging from a thick fog. The dim glow of the basement workshop, filtering through the gap in the door, seemed to mirror my mood. Beyond the wooden divider, a racket sat firmly clamped in its vise, a remnant of my earlier work session. I could hear our youngest two kids playing in the Disney movie they were watching in the rec room. Sitting in my old chair, I glanced at the clock. I'd been there for over half an hour, lost in thought, trying to block out whatever I didn't want to hear. Dinner was done. Sally cleaned up while I headed to the basement to reg loose some rackets for the fall racquetball leagues. I'd been playing for years, usually in the A bracket, and I took pride in my skills and fitness. At 6'2", and about 200 pounds, I kept in good shape despite the demands of my engineering job at GM. Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, followed me down to watch a movie with her younger sister, Allie. At this age, Allie always tagged along with Jessie. I couldn't help but wonder how things would change as Jessie grew up. Our 9-year-old son, Jason, was the oldest and usually retreated to his room to build model airplanes. I finished the handles on my 3 rackets and pulled the strings tighter, preparing for a potential mid-game break. Checking on the girls, I saw they were absorbed in Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to head upstairs. As I climbed the stairs, I overheard Sally talking on the phone. I briefly considered surprising her, setting the mood for later, even though we'd already shared some time together that morning. But when I peeked through the door, I heard Sally giggling. I froze. That laugh was different. Familiar, but unsettling. Then I heard her whisper, "Sure would like to try that thing again before the word comes off." That strange comment triggered a memory from a conversation I'd had in a bar a couple of months ago. I suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed on the basement stairs, shutting the door behind me. Sally continued laughing, her voice dropping lower. I could catch only a few words. "Last time I was really on a roll. I can't wait." I didn't want her to know I was there, so I quietly retreated to my workshop, reflecting on the conversation. It reminded me of a night after a racquetball match when I had been at the bar with John and Craig. After discussing the game, the conversation shifted to women. I noticed that John and Craig seemed unusually interested in my marriage. Though they weren't trying to flirt, their prodding questions made me uncomfortable, and I'd left early a few times to avoid the topic. That night Craig was teasing John about his wife Mary, insisting he get a personal surgery. I assumed it was a vasectomy and mentioned that Sally had talked about having me get one. But we hadn't agreed yet. Craig kept smirking while John looked distressed. "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," Craig said, laughing. I was confused. "What's going on?" I asked. John blushed and explained he had a wart in a private spot. He'd seen it grow over the years, and now Mary wanted it removed. John wasn't so much concerned about the money as he was about losing his advantage in attracting other women, as the wort seemed to be a topic of interest. Realizing I wasn't comfortable with their conversation, I decided to leave. Now, sitting in the dark, I couldn't believe Sally could be involved in something like what her phone call suggested. Sally knew John and Craig from racquetball, but I didn't think they'd ever met her. The pieces started connecting, and I couldn't ignore the possibility that something was going on. Sweating, I hoped there was a logical explanation, but Debbie, Sally's boss, was clearly involved. Debbie had been with the company for 5 years and had become a close friend to Sally. They'd bonded when both were pregnant, and over time their families socialized a few times, though we were never close. John and Craig had joined the Wise Racquetball League a couple of years ago. Despite similar family situations, we only socialized at games or afterward over beers, over with our families. It wasn't until recently, when I mentioned the store where Sally worked, that I learned Debbie was an acquaintance of John and Craig. They had attended the same high school, and John mentioned they saw each other a couple of times a year. About 2 years ago, when Allie was in the midst of the terrible twos, Sally had been struggling. Jessie went to daycare, and I was working extra hours. One night, Sally broke down from exhaustion, and after comforting her, I offered to take full responsibility for the kids on her next day off so she could get a break. She thanked me and said she'd think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally said she talked to Debbie about needing a break. Debbie suggested a shopping trip to upscale malls in Detroit. Though I had reservations, I agreed. Sally and Debbie left on a Saturday morning, checked into a motel, had dinner, and saw a movie. I insisted on getting the hotel info, which she provided. The next day they checked out, went to another mall, and returned home by 5 p.m. Sally was grateful for the trip and hugged me when she got home, sharing all the details. She hadn't gone overboard shopping but bought a few nice things for herself and the kids. I was glad she had a good time, and the kids were well behaved, so I had no complaints. Over 2 years ago, after Sally's first shopping trip with Debbie, it became a regular thing. Every few months they'd leave Saturday morning and return late Sunday. I didn't mind much. I enjoyed time with the kids, and Sally seemed happy. I couldn't recall any major changes at first, but after the second trip Sally returned in a different mood, sullen, and a bit nervous. When I asked, she said it was nothing, just that her period had started. I recalled that since then we hadn't been intimate on the nights she returned, but we always were a few days before she left. I hadn't thought much about it until now. Sally called me from the top of the stairs. "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Can you send them up?" I sighed and went upstairs to gather them. I tried to stay calm, but emotions were building inside. When I returned, Sally was in the kitchen flipping through a cookbook. She smiled, looked me in the eye, and asked, "Is something wrong, honey?" I mumbled about a cracked racket, but kept studying her, looking for signs. She seemed normal, just Sally, my wife. She kissed me and mentioned Debbie had called to plan another shopping trip. When she said it, her eyes narrowed, and she quickly looked away. I knew something was off, and I wondered how long this had been going on. I tried to change the subject. "Do we have anything planned for next weekend?" I asked. She said there was nothing on the calendar. I suggested a VFW event on Saturday, but she wasn't interested. "I don't care if your dad goes," she said. "I'm not going. It bores me to tears." I pushed, suggesting a family trip to Cedar Point, but Sally got defensive. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island." "What's gotten into you, Phil? You've never minded me shopping before." I grew frustrated and said, "Never mind. I just thought we could do something together." She walked away saying, "You and Debbie are having fun. I'll go check on the kids." That night I pretended to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking. I heard Sally come to bed and whisper my name, but I stayed still. Eventually she rolled away and I lay awake, reflecting on everything. I thought about my childhood growing up just a few miles from where we live now. I had a normal middle-class family, my parents and older sister. My best friend Jace lived a block away. We were inseparable. He was the outgoing life of the party type, and I was quieter, more thoughtful. We spent our youth playing sports, chasing girls, and in the end, both lost our virginity before prom. In high school, I started taking drafting classes and decided to become an engineer. Jace wasn't sure what he wanted, but we both enrolled in community college. After my first year, I had a big mistake. I got arrested for drunk driving after a party and spent the night in jail. My parents bailed me out, and they were furious. After everything, I spent all my savings on fines, court fees, and lost my driver's license for a year. For the rest of the semester, I rode my moped, giving Jace rides. Eventually, I gave up on school. It felt pointless without a license or money. The next year, I enlisted in the Army, hoping my drafting skills would land me an engineering job and keep me out of Vietnam. The recruiter lied, of course. Jace decided to join me, and we enlisted as buddies, guaranteed to train together. Basic training was tough, but manageable. During aptitude tests, the Army decided we'd make good fire control specialists, which meant operating a high-tech calculator to help artillery hit targets. Afterward, we were sent to Fort Sill for more training. It wasn't great, but Jace and I had fun. A few weeks before graduation, we received orders for Vietnam. After a short break at home, we flew to Ai Quang in Vietnam, where we were assigned to battery as 2nd Battalion 11th Artillery. It was November 1969, and Nixon was reducing troop numbers. For the first few months, there wasn't much combat, just a lot of flying and some occasional raids. The highlight of our tour was a wild vacation in Bangkok. Then, our unit was sent to a remote hill in the jungle, and things took a dark turn. 4 months later, I came home on a stretcher, and Jace was dead. I was mentally and physically broken. I spent weeks in the hospital and months in rehab. After being declared almost fit for duty, I returned to Fort Sill as an assistant instructor. I enrolled in college courses to keep busy, avoiding social interactions. After a year, I applied for early release from the Army and was accepted into an engineering program at a local university. I moved back in with my parents and lived on savings, education benefits, and a part-time job. I was a classic shell-shocked Vietnam vet, bitter, withdrawn, and struggling with my experiences. I grew a beard, wore old clothes, and kept to myself. I saw a therapist occasionally, but didn't feel it helped much. I visited Jace's parents regularly to talk about him. It was the least I could do. One day, while studying in the campus center, a woman approached and asked if she could sit with me. She had striking red hair and a pale complexion. I was immediately struck by her, but when she asked if I was a Vietnam vet, I flinched. I said yes, but left it at that. She mentioned her dad was a Korean War vet, and I relaxed a bit. We talked for a while until she had to leave for class. A couple of days later, she returned and asked if she could sit with me again. This time, I was more composed, and we chatted like old friends. Eventually, she realized she didn't know my name. So I introduced myself. "Phil Robinson," I said. "Sally Baxter," she replied, laughing. And just like that, I met Sally. It turned out that Sally and I had long breaks between classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Over the next few weeks, we spent most of those breaks together. She shared almost everything about her life: family, friends, career plans, and I was fascinated by her outgoing social personality. She reminded me a lot of Jace. I told her about my family and classes, but avoided talking about the Army. I preferred to listen to her. Her voice could have read me the phone book, and I'd still be interested. Slowly, I started taking better care of myself, shaving, getting a haircut, and dressing better. My mom noticed and teased me, but she was clearly happy for me. A few weeks in, I finally asked her out. She agreed right away, but warned, my dad can be tough on guys who ask me out. I told her, if dating you means dealing with your dad, it's worth it. She blushed and called me a flatterer. That Friday, I knocked on her door and was greeted by her mother, Emily, who welcomed me warmly. Before I could say anything, she called, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." Emily introduced herself, and we shook hands. Soon, Sally's father, Jack, appeared. He was big about my height, but much heavier, and his presence was imposing. He shook my hand firmly and invited me into the family room. As we sat, I noticed military memorabilia, including a Marine Corps flag and an M1 Grand Rifle displayed proudly above the fireplace. Jack, a Korean War veteran, mentioned his service and injuries, and I briefly shared that I was a Vietnam vet. We talked about military history, and Jack seemed skeptical, even dismissive of my role. He muttered about Vietnamization and the end of the war, but Emily tried to steer the conversation away from politics. Sally entered, and we quickly shifted topics to school. After a while, we said our goodbyes, and I took Sally out to dinner and a movie. The evening was mostly a blur, as I was so focused on her. We held hands, sitting so close that our heads almost touched. Afterward, we stopped by a bar for a drink, and I walked her to the door. I hesitated, unsure whether to kiss her, but she reached up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and whispered, "Thank you for a wonderful evening." Time seemed to stop as I looked into her eyes, realizing I had fallen in love with her. I kissed her gently, and from that moment on, we shared intimate moments like that, holding each other close, unable to hide our feelings. The next day, I called Sally, and we talked for an hour. We quickly made plans for another date, and just like that, we became exclusive. A few weeks later, when I mentioned booking a motel room for the weekend, she blushed, but smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I hoped for, though there were a few awkward moments when she noticed the scars from Vietnam. I reassured her that I was fine. I whispered, "Sally, I love you. I can't help it." She pulled back tears in her eyes and smiled. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this." Relieved, I kissed her nose and said, "I want to do this again and again." That night was perfect. For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace. We talked about our future, marriage, kids, where to live. Sally was graduating soon, and I would follow a year later. We decided she'd work after graduation, and we'd marry when I finished school. In the meantime, I rented an apartment so we could be together. A week later, I introduced Sally to my parents. They hit it off right away, and my mom later told me she loved Sally for how she brought me out of my shell. I was happy again, smiling constantly, even to the point that my therapist kicked me out, telling me I didn't need his help anymore. Sally's father, Jack, and I had a tense relationship. He was protective, especially when we discussed living together before marriage. But things changed when Jack invited me over for a private conversation. After some small talk, Jack mentioned Sally had told him about my scars. I felt uncomfortable, but Jack understood. We briefly discussed my time in Vietnam, and I told him I had been at Rip Court in the summer of '70. To my surprise, Jack knew about it. After that, he treated me like family. Things moved quickly after that. Sally graduated with honors, got a job, and spent more time with me. Her parents, however, thought she should move in with me permanently. I graduated on time, got a job at General Motors, and 2 months later, we got married. We bought a small house, and a year later, our son Jason was born. 2 years after that, we had Jesse, and then Allison, 3 years later. The birth of our kids changed everything. Sally worked part-time after Jason was born, and planned to return full-time once the kids were older. Meanwhile, my work evolved as I transitioned into automated manufacturing. By the time Allison was born, I was part of a team learning about the first computer-aided design systems. Life was good. We had plenty of money, 2 cars, and a nice home. Over the years, we expanded with a new bedroom, bathroom, and rec room. We had 3 healthy, beautiful kids and took family vacations every year. Twice a year, Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents for a long weekend. I always thought our marriage was strong. We loved each other openly, holding hands, hugging, and sharing affection. I often told Sally how lucky I was, but recently, I wasn't so sure anymore. Sleep became elusive, and I spent most nights staring at the wall, barely getting any rest. I skipped my usual morning workout and instead sat at my desk, trying to figure out what was going wrong. I couldn't ask Sally directly. If she was hiding something, she might not tell me the truth. I wasn't even sure what the truth was, but I had a sinking feeling that something was off. I loved Sally and the kids. The thought of losing them terrified me. But the idea that Sally might not love me anymore was even scarier. For days, I felt like a zombie, distracted and disconnected from everything. It wasn't until Jace mentioned my behavior that Sally noticed. I brushed it off as work stress. On Tuesday, I returned to my routine and played racquetball. John and Craig were there, as usual. I'd never seen one without the other, and something about their closeness started to unsettle me. They acted like they shared some secret, and when they smirked at me, I began to see them as rivals. We played a few casual games, but my mind was elsewhere. By Wednesday, I decided to check on their whereabouts. I called John's house, and his wife said he was going to a business conference in Detroit. When I called Craig's house, I got the same answer. My heart sank. I didn't need proof. This was it. I knew they'd met up together. But how far had it gone? I was furious. A voice inside me said, "Do something." That Friday, I stopped by my parents' house. They were renovating in preparation for a potential move to Florida, but I needed their support. After some small talk, I finally blurted out, "I think Sally is cheating on me." The words broke something inside me, and I cried for the first time. My parents were shocked. Mom whispered, "No, not Sally. She wouldn't do that to you." Dad asked, "Why do you think that?" I told him everything. What I had overheard, what I'd learned. Mom cried quietly, and Dad comforted her, asking, "What do you need from us?" "I need to know for sure. Can you take the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I have to be where they'll be tomorrow night." Dad hesitated, then agreed. "Sure, Phil, but I pray this is all a misunderstanding." "Yeah, me too," I said, though I wasn't sure how it could be. I left feeling hollow, uncertain of what came next. When I got home, Sally was cheerfully finishing dinner. She greeted me with a hug and a kiss, saying, "The kids are in the break room. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. She seemed preoccupied, practically buzzing with energy. It struck me that we hadn't been intimate since the previous Saturday, and we'd missed our usual midweek meeting. I'd been in a bad mood all week, taking sleeping pills to get through the nights, and Sally never mentioned it. I hesitated, then suggested, "How about we put the kids to bed early and have some time for ourselves tonight?" Sally stepped back, and her smile faltered. "I got my period early today," she said, clearly uncomfortable. I forced a smile. "Okay, I understand." She gently stroked my cheek and promised, "As soon as my period is over, I'll explain everything." I nodded, muttering, "Then it's a date." She hugged me and returned to cooking. I slowly headed upstairs, anger brewing inside me. I now knew she was saving herself for tomorrow's date. The voice in my head grew louder. "Do something." At dinner, I struggled to hide my emotions. The kids chattered away, unaware. Could this be the last time we had dinner together as a family? The thought brought tears to my eyes. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The kids cleaned their rooms, then watched cartoons. I spent time in the garage until Sally was ready to leave. She came downstairs with her suitcase, reminding the kids to behave while she was gone. Allie clung to her, demanding she buy her something. Sally promised, kissed Allie goodbye, and left for the hotel. I watched her drive off, holding Allie in my arms. Once she was out of sight, I turned to the kids and told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house for the night. They packed quickly and we headed out. At my parents' house, Dad gave me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." "I hope so too," I replied. "Thanks for helping. I'll call you in the morning." I left, switching cars at Avis to avoid recognition. Back home, I sat in the kitchen, replaying the week's events. The phone finally rang around 1 a.m. It was Sally. "Is that you, Phil?" "Yeah, it's me. Is everything okay?" I asked with a touch of sarcasm. "We're fine. We stopped for lunch. We're in room 168 555 645 0168, she replied, before rushing off. Debbie's waving at me. "We're spending the afternoon at Meadowbrook Shopping Center. I'll see you tomorrow." The phone clicked off without her saying, "I love you." That morning, she hadn't said it either. I dialed the Red Roof Inn, confirming Sally had checked in. I decided I wouldn't call her room. I'd see her later. I hung up, then dialed again. I called the Red Roof Inn again, asking if John Harrison was registered. They confirmed he was, but hadn't checked in yet. I said I'd call back later and hung up, trying to control the rising anger that felt like it could explode at any moment. I went into the workshop, unlocked the tool cabinet, and stood staring at my dad's old rifle. I thought about taking one with me, but the idea of never seeing my kids again stopped me. Instead, I grabbed a beat-up shoebox from the drawer and pulled out a sea knife I'd bought in Bangkok. I strapped it to my calf, then gathered a few things, driving gloves, water, candy bars, and headed out at 2 p.m. for the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I parked near the Red Roof Inn, by room 168, but didn't see Sally's car. I waited, thinking about her and the kids. Around 5, I saw John and Craig arrive in a red pickup, laughing and unloading bags. They went into a nearby room, and after about 45 minutes they left. I followed them to Tupper's Pub, where I parked on the street and waited. Soon, I spotted Sally's car and parked so I could see both it and the truck. I debated going inside but stayed in the car, listening to country songs that matched my mood. At 9 p.m., the four of them finally left, laughing and holding hands. I decided to beat them back to the hotel. I parked, and 10 minutes later, they pulled in. I watched them outside, talking and laughing under the light by room 1. John tossed a coin and Craig kissed Sally. Debbie grabbed John's hand, and they all went into different rooms, still laughing. My mind raced. Was this some kind of game? The pain hit hard, and the voice in my head screamed, "Do something." I couldn't undo what had happened. 10 years of marriage, a family all ruined. What good would confronting them do now? At least I'd know the truth. Then John came out of Debbie's room, holding a beer, dressed in boxer shorts. He walked over to Sally's room and knocked. A few minutes later, Craig came out of Debbie's room, no shirt or shoes. They talked briefly before high-fiving each other. John went into Sally's room, and Craig went back to Debbie's. Suddenly, it hit me. I'd completely lost control. A voice screamed in my head, "Do something now." I felt a surge of madness. Unable to stop, I put on my driving gloves, got out of the car, and walked straight to room 168. I covered the peephole with my thumb and knocked twice. As the door began to open and John said, "What the hell, Craig?" I threw a punch, kicking him with all my anger. John stumbled back and fell to the floor, hands over his face. I noticed the disarray in the room, the overturned bed, the bathroom door slightly ajar, and the shower running. I unsheathed my knife and tapped it against John's nose. His eyes widened in fear. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. 2 years, he stammered, eyes wide. Joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence. "No," he whispered, closing his eyes in pain. I leaned in. "You're sick, John. Look at me." I paused. "If you ever go near Sally or any other married woman again, I'll find you and make sure you regret it. Understand?" "Yes," he wheezed, terrified. Suddenly I smelled something foul. The shower stopped, and I heard Sally's voice. "Hey, John boy, I thought you were joining me in the shower." I turned, just as Sally appeared in the bathroom doorway. Towel in hand, her face draining of color as she saw me. Shock overtook her as the towel fell to the floor. "John Boy doesn't seem well," I growled, stepping toward her. Panic flashed in her eyes as she slammed the bathroom door shut. I walked over to the nightstand, cut the phone cord with my knife, and sheathed the blade. Then I stormed out, but not before throwing the phone violently into the bathroom door, causing a loud crash and a terrified scream from inside. I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and realized I wasn't done yet. I headed to the next room. I knocked on the door of Craig's room. When it opened, I punched him under the chin. He went down, and Debbie, wide-eyed and in a panic, sat in bed. I checked Craig's pulse. He was fading. I went to the nightstand, pulled the phone cord, and turned to Debbie. "If you tell your husband about tonight, tell him I said hi," I said sarcastically, then added, "or maybe I'll tell them myself." I tossed the phone into the corner and left. Outside, I looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, the tension gradually fading. The voice in my head was silent now. Everything was done. It was time to move on with my life. As I made my way to the car, my phone rang. Annoyed, I answered, "Yeah." "Phil, it's Jack," came the voice on the other end. "What's going on?" I asked, my tone uninterested. "Sally's at the house crying. She says she's afraid to go home." I glanced at the clock. Almost 1 p.m., nearly 14 hours since I'd left Rochester Hills. I don't know what I could have done, I muttered, feeling confused. "She says you hurt Debbie's friends badly last night." "Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't eliminate them," I shot back sarcastically. "What the hell? That's not like you," Jack responded, clearly shocked. I paused for a moment, then asked, "Did Sally tell you where the fight happened?" "She mentioned it was outside a restaurant in Rochester Hills, so she's trying to avoid it," Jack replied, his tone sharp. "Well, with her family and history," I trailed off. "Sally's your daughter, so I guess it must be true," I said slowly, sensing Jack was processing everything. "Phil, I'm bringing Sally home. We need to talk," Jack said. "No problem," I replied. "I'm not going anywhere." Jack hung up, but I heard Sally in the background. "No, Dad, no." I sighed. "She's not making this easy," I thought. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my second beer and looking through old photos when Jack and Sally arrived. Sally clung to Jack's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Please, Dad, let us talk. Phil and I need some time alone." Sally was makeup-free, her hair loose, eyes red and swollen, shaking like a nervous wreck. She wouldn't look at me, trying to guide Jack back toward the door, but he sat down at the table, his eyes darting between me and the K-knife beside my beer. "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice tight. I looked at Sally and mockingly said, "Yes, Sally, tell your dad what's going on." She snapped, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can work this out." Her commanding voice didn't match the pleading in her eyes. I was furious. The idea that she thought we could fix this alone, or that she could manipulate me, pushed me further. I was determined to be as honest as she was dishonest. I turned to Jack. "Sally and her boss Debbie have a couple of girlfriends they go out with when they're out of town. I found out and didn't take it well." I paused, then added, "I might have been a little more polite than she deserved." Sally sighed, sitting down, her face dropping. Jack looked at me in disbelief. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you." "Enough, Phil," Jack snapped, his anger rising. "You're being cruel." I stared at him, then shot back. "Cruel? You would have seen what I saw last night, another man's footprints in her hotel room." I said it flatly. Jack's eyes flicked to Sally, and her panicked expression made it clear I was telling the truth. Jack slumped in his chair, his face crumpling as he covered it with his hands, whispering, "Oh God." Sally's face turned pale. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, can't we?" "Please, Phil," she begged. I said nothing, just sifted through the old photos, lost in the pain of the past. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up, wiped his eyes and asked, "What are you going to do, Phil?" He looked at Sally, whose tears hadn't stopped. I thought for a moment, then said, "I never told either of you about Vietnam or ripcord," I sighed. "Hell, I never told anyone about ripcord, not even my therapist." I waved at the pile of photos on the table. "Isn't it funny, Jack? Your generation proudly displays their war medals while mine hides its memories in shoeboxes, locked away." I picked up an old faded photo of two young soldiers in jungle uniforms, smiling like it was some casual outing. Jason and I were dropped at Ripcord in May 1971. It was just another base in our rotation, set up tools, supported the troops, and moved on. I'd paused looking at Jack. But this time, it was different. We were stationed on a remote ridge near the Laos border overlooking the Ixio Valley. It was a bad place for the U.S. military. Previous battles there had cost many lives. The Ripcord base was meant to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne, trying to stop the NVA from pushing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I shook my head. What a joke. The base had our 155 battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of infantry. We had 2 helicopter pads and a few other basic units, maybe 400 men at most. The whole base was underground, bunkers, trenches, tunnels. We didn't know until later that we were surrounded by 12,000 NVA soldiers. I met Jack's eyes. "Does that remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir?" Jack nodded slowly, lost in thought. After a moment of silence, I spoke. "The first few weeks weren't so bad for us," I said. "But for those dropped into combat positions on the hills, it was hell. Helicopters were in and out from dawn till dusk. We only took occasional sniper or automatic fire, but the incoming anti-aircraft fire grew stronger." I looked at Jack and continued. "On July 1st, everything changed. Just after 7 a.m., we took our first mortar fire. For the next week, the NVA bombarded us with 20-30 shells a day from 60 and 81 millimeters mortars. Then they started using 120 millimeters mortars, new weapons that had never been outside the DMZ. The worst part," I said, my voice trailing off, "was that you couldn't always hear the shells coming. The wind, helicopters, and artillery fire made it hard to tell. One day, I was running from the mess hall to the bunker when a mortar blast knocked me down. I got to the bunker and Jace, looking up, said, 'Damn, Phil, you're bleeding.' I smiled weakly at the memory. I'd forgotten my body armor that day. Never again," I added with a sigh. "The shrapnel shot me under my right shoulder blade. They evacuated me to Camp Evans to have it removed. It wasn't serious, but they kept me for a couple of days for a concussion. By the time I returned to Ripcord, we were taking 70-80 shells a day. It got heavier. Mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless tools. We were losing more men every day. Our tools were firing nonstop. We were using so much ammo. The batteries ran out in hours. Chinooks brought in more shells, while 51 caliber NVA fire rained down on them. Once they dropped off ammo, we rushed in to load the tools." I paused, recalling the chaos. "During one of these operations, I took another half-dozen shrapnel wounds. Between the constant bombardment, our regular work, and bringing ammo to the tools, we were beyond exhausted. Planes, F-4s, Phantoms, even B-52s, were constantly around, bombing the hills. Smoke and tear gas from the NVA lingered in the air. And after July 8th, when we first spotted the dinkies in the wire, we were on high alert every night. We knew an attack was coming. We just didn't know when." The room was quiet, the weight of the moment settling in. Jack's face was grim, and Sally looked like she was bracing herself. I took a deep breath. As the shelling continued, we started taking serious casualties. Morale was plummeting. We felt abandoned. Before it was over, I said quietly, "We lost over 500 men, dead and wounded." I was assigned to carry body bags to the helipad for evacuation. I looked at Jack, my eyes filling. On July 18th, the worst thing happened. A Chinook carrying howitzer shells was hit and crashed over a battery and ammo supply point. The explosion was massive. The battery burst into flames and explosions kept going for hours. All 6 tools were destroyed and dozens of men were injured. I paused, the image still fresh. We rushed to the battery to help. Many of the wounded had severe burns from the aviation fuel. Jace and I lifted one machine gunner onto a stretcher. When I grabbed his arm, the skin came off in my hand. The smell of burning flesh, I'll never forget it. Jack nodded gravely, his face filled with grief. Sally looked horrified as I spoke. I wiped my eyes and pressed on. We all knew this position wouldn't hold, but the brass didn't care. They saw it as a chance to hit the enemy. After all, we had almost 4 NVA regiments in one spot. A few nights later, I said, my voice growing colder. We went on high alert. We were hit with automatic weapons fire around the perimeter. Jace and I set up an M60 in a trench in front of the FDC bunker ready for an attack. The mortar platoon kept firing flares, and the infantry returned fire along the jungle's edge. Every few minutes, I continued. Artillery ships flew overhead, firing rockets and miniguns at suspicious targets. Jace and I didn't return fire often to avoid drawing attention to our position, especially since there was an infantry squad just 20-30 yards ahead. This night, I went on, my tone distant. The infantry kept popping up and firing grenades and automatic weapons. Then suddenly 20 MLDA mortar rounds hit their position. The ground shook as we dove into our foxhole. I paused, the danger still fresh in my mind. When we peeked out, the infantry trench was completely buried. We quickly took up firing positions, and Jace started shooting while I fed him ammo. The platoon sergeant crawled over, and we told him what happened. He nodded, ducked down, and rushed off for more ammo. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. Just as we were finishing the last ammo belt, I heard an M16 shot. It felt like being hit with a baseball bat in my back and thighs. I collapsed on the edge of the trench, staring into Jace's eyes. I saw the realization in his face, but he couldn't speak. I held his hand. He squeezed it once, then the light left his eyes. I knew it was over. My throat tightened. My best friend, my brother, was gone. I felt completely alone. I wiped my eyes again, hearing Sally sniffle, but I wasn't sure whether it was for Jace or her own emotions. I took a deep breath and went on. I looked up to see Corporal Tran standing in front of us, and M16 aimed at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts, a North Vietnamese deserter. He fired a whole clip at us. I took a couple of bullets in my back, but my body armor saved me from worse, though I had broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet shot my thigh, but didn't hit bone. I started to go into shock, realizing Jace was gone, and I'd been shot. I paused, steadying myself. I fought to stay conscious. I couldn't let myself pass out. I focused on anger, thinking of getting revenge on the enemy. As the rage built, my vision blurred and my mind clouded with hatred. Tran noticed I was moving and tried to shoot again, but he had emptied his clip. I played dead, and he must have decided I was done. He dropped his rifle, jumped over our trench, and started waving a flashlight, shouting in Vietnamese. I pressed on, shaking as I recalled the chaos. Then a rocket-propelled grenade flew from the bushes, narrowly missing both of us. Tran kept waving his flashlight like a madman. Through the flare light, I saw 3 figures. Sappers emerge from the jungle, wearing satchel charges and holding AK-47s. I barely had the strength to stand, but I grabbed the M60 beneath Jace and aimed at them. I fired 2 long bursts before the belt ran out. The sappers went down, and Tran stared at me, shocked. He screamed, spitting as he grabbed a mache from his belt. Most scouts carried them to navigate the jungle, I added. I barely had time to get my foot on the trench's edge and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and grabbed my knife. We were almost unconscious, but I managed to get on top of him. He reached for the mash sheet, but never got it. I closed my eyes, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by the flickering light of flares, explosions, tracer rounds, howitzers rumbling, and the smell of cordite and burning debris. It felt like I was in hell. I continued hoarsely. Eric, my platoon sergeant, pulled me by one arm and Lieutenant Dixon by the other. Dixon was shouting for me to get to the bunker. Napalm was coming, and we were too close to the wire. I took a sip of beer, tracing my knife across the purple hearts on the table. Jack and Sally were silent. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I went on. That's when I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker with an IV in my arm. A battalion surgeon and corpsmen were working on me. Doc said I'd probably survive, and that they'd evacuate me at dawn. I added, my voice shaky. I was flown out around noon, miraculously. Every helicopter was under heavy fire. 2 had already been shot down. Mine took several hits, one that liquidated the crew commander. But by then, they decided to evacuate Ripcord. I paused looking at the table. They took everyone out on the 21st and bombed the place. I didn't care. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to Japan, then transferred to Walter Reed for a month. I sighed deeply. While I was there, some colonel who probably never heard of Ripcord handed me a medal for eliminating my enemies. I took the silver star from the box and placed it beside the purple hearts. It was the same one on Jack's mantle. I shook my head. The doctors treated me well, but mentally I wasn't fine. I had nightmares every night. Couldn't shake the sounds, smells, and faces of the dead and wounded. I paused, looking away. I missed Jace's funeral, but went home before reporting to Silbase. I visited Jace's parents. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They wanted to know about Vietnam, what happened to Jace, but didn't ask a single question. I swallowed, struggling to speak. Why did I survive? And he didn't. I said softly. I asked myself that every day. I stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. I was in therapy, but felt withdrawn from the world. I did the bare minimum at Fort Sill, and buried myself in college drafting to avoid socializing. When I left the Army, I moved back with my parents and went to school, not because I cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I looked up at Sally. Then I met you, I whispered. Sally lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. You brought me back to life. You were happy, engaged in everything, beautiful inside and out. Everything I thought I wasn't. You made me want to live again. You gave me a glimpse of what life could be. She paused, her voice breaking. I fell in love with you. You saved me, and you gave me 3 beautiful children. I'll always be grateful for that. I sighed. For a while we just sat there, not moving. Finally Jack cleared his throat. What now, Phil? I turned to him tired. Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend. Sally started sobbing. No, no, no. The room was silent. Sally cried. Jack and I had tears in our eyes. Jack asked quietly, Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away over one mistake? Sally lifted her head, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I knew what I had to say would end our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie stand. I shook my head. The mistake wasn't just one, Jack. I looked at Sally, my voice firm. I found out last night that Sally's been cheating on me for almost 2 years, and it wasn't just with one man. Sally sighed, closed her eyes and shook her head, sinking deeper into her chair, looking even paler than before. I turned to Jack. Does that answer your question? I asked. Jack stood up slowly, his eyes full of sorrow as he looked at Sally. You're my daughter, and I should love you, but I've lost all respect for you, your actions. He trailed off, unable to find the words, just shaking his head. Sally reached out, but Jack pulled away. He looked at me and said firmly, Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do, but don't hurt her. I couldn't take it anymore. No, Jack, I'm beyond that, I replied. But if it makes you feel better, take this. I slipped the knife back into its sheath and handed it to him. Jack accepted it silently, then turned to leave. His shoulders slumped, and I could tell he was already thinking about how to tell Emily when the door closed behind him. The phone rang, but neither of us moved or spoke. The ringing eventually stopped, and the silence was deafening. Finally, I broke it, staring blankly ahead. I thought the cops would be here this morning, not your father. Sally flinched and stumbled over her words. Debbie and I told them to say we were attacked outside the bar. We hoped if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives. I processed this, realizing I was free. There was no way their story would hold up. For a moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But then I remembered everything was falling apart around me. So, where are they now? I asked flatly. Sally cleared her throat, fidgeting in her chair. They're still in the hospital, under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, broken teeth, and a concussion. I replied bluntly, don't forget their balls, Sally. Fear filterized. No, you really hurt them. She paused, then added, I didn't know you were so cruel, Phil. Did you have to do that? I stared at her incredulous. You're defending those fools, I said sarcastically. Before she could respond, the phone rang again. You should answer it, I said, heading to the bathroom. It's probably for you. I washed my face, looking at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked as worn down as I felt. It had been a sleepless night. Back in the kitchen, Sally was standing there staring at the phone. Slowly, she hung it up and collapsed into a chair. When I sat back down, she spoke, her voice distant. Did you have to tell Debbie's husband? I shrugged. Why shouldn't I? He already called John and Craig's wives and kicked Debbie out. She's going to need a lawyer if she wants to see her daughter. Sally started crying again. Crap. Through her tears, she looked up at me. And she fired me, said it was all my fault. I laughed bitterly. Oh, that's just perfect. I paused. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it? Through sniffles, she asked. How did you know? I smiled grimly. When I told Josh about what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't believe me. Called me a liar. Accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But when I mentioned John Harrison's name, he turned pale and started swearing. First time I ever saw him angry, I paused. You told me years ago that Debbie's second marriage was strained, and she was estranged from her parents. Well, she has a sister upstate she doesn't talk to either. I took a breath. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company and met Sarah, Debbie's sister. They hit it off, and one night, Sarah invited him to dinner with her husband, Dave. Sarah had a story to tell. I looked at Sally, whose face had gone white with shock. Turns out Dave was Debbie's first husband. She cheated on him throughout their marriage. He found out, kicked her out, and filed for divorce. I stopped watching Sally's reaction. Debbie never told Josh any of this. And guess who she had an affair with during her first marriage? That's right, John Harrison. Sally froze. I continued. When I mentioned John's name, Josh put the pieces together and realized Debbie had been doing the same thing to him that you did to me. No wonder he threw her out. I took a deep breath. And like Josh, I'm wondering how long you've been fooling around with me, I said firmly. Sally cried again. Oh my God, Phil, it was just John and Craig just during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I hadn't thought about anyone else until Debbie mentioned it. Before our first shopping trip, she sat there twirling a handkerchief, crying and begging. Please, Phil, I don't know how I ended up here. It's like I woke up from a nightmare. When I walked into the bathroom and saw you there, I didn't say anything. Just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she spoke quickly. I knew Debbie liked to play, but I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone on our trip. She paused, biting her lip. John showed up at the restaurant. Debbie said she'd known him since high school, but I suspected that wasn't true. He was charming, flirted, danced with both of us, complimented me a lot. I had a few more drinks than usual, and when his hands got too familiar on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, Debbie went with John to the room next to ours. I realized she set the whole thing up. The walls were thin, and I could hear them all night. That explains why you were like that when you came home, right? I looked at her with disgust. Sally, you're unbelievable. Sally hung her head and wiped her eyes. The next morning John was gone. We had breakfast, and Debbie went on and on about their night together, raving about him the whole way home. She paused, then added, over the next few months, Debbie and I had lunch a couple times a week. She'd always talk about John and how much fun they had. That's when I first heard about his wart, Sally said softly. Debbie joked I should try it, but at first I just laughed it off. The more she talked, though, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another shopping trip came up, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she didn't mind. I laughed, but I asked her what she'd do if I went along with it. Sally continued. She said John had a friend, Craig, who would keep her company. I didn't say no, though I don't know why. I told her I'd think about it, but I wasn't sure I could. Sally looked at me, but I just stared back, blankly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but I thought I could do it, and no one would ever know. She looked down again, her voice soft. That Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner, drinks, and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples and I ended up with John. I'd had enough to drink by then and convinced myself it was fine. Everyone was having a great time. Later, we went back to the motel and John and I went to our room while Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent, staring at her hands. I finally spoke dismissively. So, was it what you expected? Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. It was fine. It wasn't better than what we have, but it was exciting because it was wrong, and I could pretend to be someone else. You mean it wasn't just okay? I said bitterly. He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband at home, the one who takes care of the kids so you could be alone. Sally turned away, fighting a sob. Yes, she whispered. And Craig, my husband, I said sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied. After we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked she was starting to miss him. I didn't think much about it, but the next trip when we split into couples, I danced with Craig most of the night. Later, he came to my room, and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then a couple trips later, John and Craig swapped in the middle of the night. I didn't realize it first until I woke up and realized the man in my bed wasn't the one I started with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like two different people living in two different worlds. I liked our life, our family, but I got hooked on those weekends. I thought I could have both, and you'd never find out. How stupid was I? Damn stupid, I agreed. And then when you saw me at the motel, I looked in the mirror and realized what I had become, she whispered. I stood up and looked down at her. Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe it does for you. I'm going to get the kids. Tonight, after Allie's asleep, we'll sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them their parents will be living apart. I'll leave out the details to minimize the trauma. I'll sleep on the couch until I figure out what comes next. Sally shouted after me, crying. Phil, don't do this. I love you. Please don't. I turned to her. Why not? Through sobs, she begged. It was only a few nights a year. I never saw John or Craig outside those weekends. Please, Phil, forgive me. Let me fix it. Forgive you. I shook my head. Forgive you for being a promiscuous for other men a few nights a year. For giving away the thing you valued most, yourself, for destroying my trust, my belief that we belong to each other. I sighed. And how do you fix that? Can you undo it? Can you not be with John or Craig? Because that's what it takes to make it right. I looked around the kitchen, the family photos, the kids' drawings, Allie's baby chair in the corner, everything that made this place a home. I spent most of last night thinking about how I'll feel in 6 months, a year or 5 years. I might forgive you, but I won't forget. I paused, my voice breaking. Every time I see you, I'll remember last night. Every time I hear your voice or your name, I'll think of it. And that's Sally. I can't live with. I stood silently for a moment, barely noticing Sally rocking back and forth, crying, whispering, "No, please, God, no." A few minutes later, I spoke softly. "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked up at me, empty-eyed, like a condemned prisoner awaiting the sentence. "You lost the man who loved you more than anything. You lost the respect of your parents, my parents, and me. You lost your job. And someday, you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it?" After a long silence, broken only by her sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.